as Justus introduced me, I'm Artūrs, and I'm working in the performance testing, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about load testing more specifically. First of all, some background. Been working in a company called Test Dev Lab for more than 10 years now. Started out as intern there doing just various manual QA stuff, but fairly quickly got into performance testing. My first experience there was with WebRTC. That's something I'm still doing today as well. But yeah, shortly after joining Test Dev Lab, I also started to build a tool called Lodero. Originally, it was a WebRTC testing tool, so we were testing rooms with 50 plus users. But after a couple of months, we also realized that it's very good for testing, load testing other applications. And I'll probably go a little bit into that later as well. Anyhow, yeah, as we started doing load tests, got into working with client projects. So in my case, those projects are super short. Usually the client comes within 2 to 3 weeks. We're done with the project. We've done the load test. And currently, Lodero is being worked on a little bit less. We're using it as an internal tool still. But my role in the Test Dev Lab company is manager for different performance testing projects. So load, WebRTC, battery testing, benchmarking services, whatnot. Yeah. So the point I want to carry across is when was the last time you did any sort of load testing? Like I'm working in this sphere, and what I see is that people often overlook load tests. People just rely on the application being fine. I don't have a lot of experience in security testing area, but I feel that it's sometimes the same there. Until there is an incident, nobody really worries about load testing. Like in Latvia, we have, well, not a joke, but every year we have to submit these annual declarations to our local IRS, and every year the system is failing. So we've tried to approach them with load testing offers like, hey, we'll try to sort this out, so maintain the reputation, whatnot, but haven't worked out. Yeah, so what I'm saying is that load tests are very often being ignored. In many cases, nobody really even bothers to do any load testing. And what I see based on the projects that I've done is that there is a lack of risk assessment. That's one of the things. So in many cases, like I'm basing this off from the projects that I've done, from the cases where almost always we find something wrong. Like the usual scenario for us is that the customer comes, says we want to test with 5,000 users. We start slow, and by the time we get to 1,000 users, there are some problems, and the customer says, okay, thank you, we'll go fix them, and then we can continue. Lately, a thing I've been focusing on as well is risk of continuous quality degradation. So with load testing, an aspect we're looking into a lot is how the response times change as we're doing load tests. And that kind of is a little bit different type of performance testing, but on the same topic. So there, what we're doing quite a lot and what we're seeing quite a lot is that over time you don't even notice how the performance changes. Meaning that you could add features, and not even notice how response times got from 50 to 150 milliseconds or worse. And yeah, load tests are apparently complex in the sense that with functional testing, it's quite clear. So if you press a button, something should happen. That's very simple to test and verify. But with load tests, if I say that the response time is 80 milliseconds, is that good? Is that bad? Is it a pass or a fail? So different kinds of performance tests get ignored easily. Yeah, very quickly, a couple of reasons why load tests need to be done. Obviously, gain confidence, identify performance problems, and fix functional defects. So in our experience, there have been a lot of cases where we discover functional defects that happen 5% of the time, 2% of the time. Quite early in my performance testing career, we were doing load tests for a messaging application. And what we discovered is that under a couple thousand requests per second, there were some memory allocation issues. So essentially, the application was trying to override the same memory that it had used before. So in functional testing, we would never have discovered this problem. We're not just running enough load to discover this. But once we're running enough load, we start seeing these problems that just accumulate over time or happen once in a million events. With load testing, we're running enough events so that we can see these problems. In many cases, we're also testing third-party providers. It's a slippery slope with that one, as if it's not arranged, then these providers can come back biting, but this is something that providers sometimes want to do. And yeah, well, the most boring reason usually is to provide evidence that the application works. There are a couple of projects where we've done performance and load testing just because the customer says, like, we have the specification here, especially government procurements, where we just need to provide this evidence. And yeah, in my government project experience, it's complex. And yeah, well, the screenshot below, in some cases, like most of my experience is load arrow, so that's end-to-end load testing, which is not something that many people do. But what we sometimes see is, and what we didn't expect to see at the beginning, is we're essentially load testing a website. So we're load testing a regular website, so we're not expecting like static files to fail, but we do observe CSS files not loading or JavaScript files not loading, which is, that was the last place we expected some problems to appear, but there they are. Yeah, about the timing of load tests, well, the most common place where we see load tests happening is when we're preparing for some events. So Black Friday is a big one. As I mentioned, the tax declarations, at least in Latvia, that's also an event that people want to load test before. And the one type of customer that we like to see is a company seeing that, hey, we have a new contract coming up, it will double the load that we're doing, and this company wants to make sure that they will be able to handle everything, or they want to already prepare in advance to see how many servers do they need to purchase. Yeah, after deploying significant changes, migrating data centers, that's also a place where people want to do load tests, and ideally on a regular basis. Realistically, in the first two scenarios, the company comes to us when it's like 2 weeks to deployment, 3 weeks to deployment, and say, hey, we need to do a load test next week, can you do it now? So yeah, in many cases, that's the life that we're living, that for a couple of months we don't have anything to do really, and then we have 5 projects running at the same time with deadline yesterday. And yeah, actually in this screenshot below, that's actually from a project we did. One of the types of issues we discovered that before the test we don't really see any CPU activity, then obviously some activity during the test. But one interesting thing we noticed is that after the test, the activity doesn't die down really. So we saw that, yeah, the event happens, but after the load event ends, there's still some activity going on. So some memory leaks or other type of leaks. Yeah, and well, while my experience is mostly with Loadero and end-to-end testing, what I wanted to go into is a little bit in other types of tests, well, different types of load tests that you can do, and that we have done in our experience. So first, and maybe in some cases easiest, maybe some cases not, low-level testing, essentially testing on a functional level, checking that the function is working properly. So in this case, very easy to verify the performance of that specific component. The tooling very specific to that component again. So if it's database, then those are some database systems. Maybe in case of Go language, there is the performance benchmarking tool built into it. Well, in this case, we're actually jumping in these tests not that often. It's very rare that we're doing these kinds of tests. These are usually done in-house, similar to unit testing. Oftentimes, these are in parallel to unit tests even. But at the same time, this is something that can be integrated very easily. Usually, you can add this even in CI pipelines without any additional costs. And just check that adding new functions maintain the performance. That's what I was talking about in the very beginning, that it's easy to not notice how the function slowly grows slower over time. Probably the most popular type of load testing is API testing. That's what almost anybody's doing. So yeah, as you probably know, in this case, we're usually using HTTP APIs. We're doing load tests. And what I personally don't really like about API testing is that the customer comes and says, we have 500 active users, so please do an API load test. But for API load tests, the metrics we're usually looking at is requests per second. So we're trying to translate how do requests per second translate into active customers, active users on the website. So at that point, it requires usually knowing a context about users, which is the place where our customers usually struggle the most, because for us, the customer can be medicine. There was a company that was dealing with horse auctions and stuff like that. So we don't know the domain, we don't know how users behave, and that's what we're usually asking the customer, like, please explain how your users behave, what's the thing that your users do on the website. Yeah. I don't believe this is the screenshot from that project, but in some cases, users require API tests when the API tests are not even the best case scenario. So we have done, for a company in Latvia, they requested that we do an API load test calling every single static file. So we started with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, everything like that, and only then got into the backend API calls. I think we had around 70 requests to do a single step, as we had to download all the static assets. Didn't really like that, but that's what they requested. And another learning that we have had very quickly with API testing, API load testing, is that we now never do any type of load testing from our internal network, because it's very unstable. Even if you have good internal network, usually that's not stable enough. What we're generally doing is we're generally deploying cloud servers where we're using essentially carrier-grade network and making sure that the network isn't the bottleneck for the test that we're doing. And yeah, finally, end-to-end load testing, which is the area that I have most experience with myself, but it's also very niche. So yeah, with Lodero, we were hoping that the niche is big enough, but is what it is. Yeah, with end-to-end load testing, the main difference is that we're testing via browser. So we're simulating users with Selenium, and we're then scaling the Selenium up. As you can imagine, going with 10,000 Selenium sessions takes quite a lot of resources. So this type of testing usually is a lot more expensive compared to API testing, but at the same time, it often uncovers very interesting insights that other types of testing don't uncover. So from our side, the main benefits that we saw, both in theory and in practice, is that we can very closely simulate the user scenarios. So if a customer comes to us and says like, hey, we have this e-commerce website, the user clicks on search, then he looks on 5 items, adds the cart, then goes to checkout, then goes back. This is something that we can easily simulate with end-to-end load testing, because we can essentially write an automation that clicks all the necessary buttons and just continues across that flow. And also, well, at least in our experience, it was much easier to create more complex scenarios. So, for example, this screenshot here, we were testing some WebRTC type of application, which we did quite a lot. In those applications, as you can imagine, different users are doing different things. At first, one person speaks, then another person speaks, then somebody does a screen share. And another thing where end-to-end testing can be very beneficial is if it's different protocols. So with WebRTC protocol, that's more complex to load test without this user interface. Other technologies, WebSockets involving different servers, calling different services, third-party services, whatnot. Those type of services, end-to-end load testing can be very beneficial. It can be much easier to set up. Again, as I said, can be a bit more expensive. And yeah, but end-to-end load testing doesn't stop with tools like Loadero. Actually, right now, we're working on a project where we're testing contact centers. So people call from their mobile phones to the contact center, and on the other side, there's an agent who picks up. In this case, and in many other similar cases, it ends up being a custom framework. So in our case, the project we're doing right now, we're simulating mobile calls, thousands of mobile calls, and on the other side we still have the Loadero agents, about 100 Loadero sessions just sitting in answering these calls. So yeah, the customer came to us with this contact center load test request. We realized that yes, the API testing and other cheaper ways of testing is not really an option, so we had to end up with end-to-end load testing. And yeah, what I can tell you in that case, simulating GSM call minutes is the most expensive part. Yeah, finally, well, what I like to call regression load tests. So we're used to thinking about mobile automation, web automation, backend test automation. But what we're focusing on is functional testing in these cases. So we're making sure the buttons work correctly, the API responses are correct. We're making sure that functionally the application is working. But what we're usually not looking at is that the application is working from a performance standpoint. And that's like, it's easy enough to establish the performance baseline. We can even take what we have today as the performance baseline, so we can run a test. We don't need a load test even. We can do a regression performance test. So we can run an API test. Let's run it, 10 times, take the average response time. So this is what the performance we have today. If we're good with it, cool, we have passed the performance test. And we can add that easily into the CI/CD pipelines and run the same test over and over again just to see if the performance changes over time. And this very much helps us to understand like at which point in time specifically we start losing performance. So if we're doing the big deployment, we easily see that, okay, the response time times have changed, like it's 5% worse, 5% better. Usually it's for the worse. But what that helps is that helps us to think about performance ahead of time, instead of when we have problems, when you don't know how to solve them really without doing any major changes. But we are aware that, okay, we did this database change, it made performance worse. Are we going to compensate it elsewhere, or we're going to do something and fix this problem? Yeah, and finally, something to take home probably is first steps in load testing. Yeah, I am quite passionate about this, and I do think that performance is a very important topic that we should think about just to make the applications better. There have been countless examples on people leaving e-commerce stores just because of poor performance. Yeah, very quickly, few steps to do load tests is first to define a goal. So think like, I want to test payment flow, I want to test checkout flow, I want to test user onboarding, login, whatever. Based on that, we can choose what tools we're using. If we're testing some specific functions, obviously functions, not functions, but low-level tools. Maybe if we're testing UI, then UI-based tools. Then we can do what you're usually doing, defining scenario, input data. In load tests, that can be a bit more complex if we need to tackle multiple users or do some authentication. But usually we can just take over something from our regular functional automation. And the one thing that we're always doing is once we're done with the test scenario, test it with like 5 requests per second. It doesn't create any load, but it usually uncovers some issues that happen with scheduling and managing this load. There are usually some race conditions there. And yeah, when it works in small scale, then we can just scale it up and see what happens if we see any performance problems, if we see CPU spikes, whatnot. And that's it. Thank you very much.
All right. As usually, there is plenty of questions in Slido, so no surprise this time as well. Let's start maybe not with the most popular one, but just start slow and we will catch up later. Load test versus performance test. Which one is more cost-effective benchmark to focus on? And maybe to expand on this one, maybe we can mention as well other performance testing types like stress, volume.
Yeah, so many times we're actually talking about these terms interchangeably, but load test is like a subset of performance testing. Performance testing, in a sense, could be anything that is not functional. Generally, we're trying to establish how quickly the application works, but with performance tests, we can do that with 1 request per second. So we can run the same functional suite and just take performance metrics, the response times, and see how that looks. In load tests, technically what we're doing is we're checking how the system behaves under expected load. So if you're expecting 500 concurrent active users, that's what we're load testing. Then, as you mentioned, stress testing, that's going beyond that 500 user mark and seeing the point where the application will break if it hasn't broken before. We have other types, endurance testing, soak testing, spike testing. That's probably a bit longer conversation, but yeah, if we generally have time, then under performance testing, we try to do different types of scenarios. So running the test for a longer period of time, seeing how the system behaves, not for 5 minutes, but for 55 minutes, or doing a very short, very rapid spike of users.
Regarding those benchmarks, what kind of industry standards you're using, or do you have like guidelines in the company that you're using to like guide your customers when maybe customers do not know like what kind of benchmarks they want?
I'd say it very much depends on the use case. I think in my experience, about half of the projects I've done are WebRTC projects. So, for example, in WebRTC, you could easily have a trade-off between frames per second and the frame size. And it always comes down to context. So, for example, if you're doing a screen share, you usually don't need 30 FPS. You can do with 1, but you need high frame size. And vice versa. So if you're watching a performance, then maybe you prefer higher FPS rather than the screen size. And for these benchmarks, it usually, again, comes down to the context. So if it's something where the user is happy to wait, then we can do with longer response times. But in other cases, you may want shorter. So generally, I don't like this question. It very much depends on context in my experience. And so for customers where they have an existing application, that's a good place to start. So you can just benchmark what you already have. You can maybe benchmark against competition, see how other competing sites look. And if you're subjectively fine with that, that's usually a good place to start. And then as you're running load test, you can easily compare how it changes.
I sense curiosity in the crowd because I was avoiding some most popular questions because we were on a high level. Let's get into implementation and address those most popular questions now. So the burning question with 22 likes. How would you test mobile app where test environment doesn't match production?
First of all, for a mobile app, most likely the test approach is API testing. So that quickly solves that question. But in this case, the approach I would probably lean towards is to establish a baseline on both environments. So establish a baseline in production, establish a baseline in testing environment, and then we can at least try to correlate. So we can't draw load conclusions on the testing environment. So if it works with 100 users on testing and the production is 4 times as powerful, we can't necessarily say that it will work on production. But what we can do is we can continuously check the quality. So if it gets worse on the test environment over time, then it will get worse on the production as well. So yeah, we have done load tests in production as well. Those are some special cases. We don't really like doing load tests in production for obvious reasons. But in some cases, when the test environment and the production don't match and it's not possible to set up a production clone, then that's an option that we usually have to do, is to establish the baseline in production, and then we can try to correlate how does it look against testing environment and compare those.
More about environments. Comparing test environment like that manual testers are using for exploratory testing, or dedicated performance test environment that is like have its responsibility for performance testing only. Which way would you prefer, or pros and cons?
Well, I think it's obvious which one I would prefer. If it's possible to set up a dedicated load test environment, then obviously that's much better, because another thing is that load tests pollute data. So we will leave a lot of data behind us. If you're testing with 10,000 concurrent users, we probably need 10,000 accounts, so they will remain there in one way or another. But the problem is that usually the customer doesn't want to pay for a dedicated environment. At best, we can do some database backups and restore from those backups after the tests, so that we at least clean up after the load tests. But usually dedicated environments are not an option, just due to how much it would cost to set them up. Maybe running them is not even the most expensive part of it.
Final question about tools, and let's merge 2 questions into this. So you mentioned tools in your slides already, but finally, can you highlight some of the tools that looks promising now and you can recommend, like? And I'm merging this question with another one. Does anyone still uses JMeter?
JMeter is used a lot, unfortunately, but yes, JMeter gets used a lot. What I think for API testing is the most promising currently is K6. It's something that looks to be growing and quite capable as well. But yeah, in the projects that at least I'm involved in, a lot of companies naturally gravitate towards JMeter because that's what they know, or maybe they have some tests from 15 years ago and they just want to continue like, hey, we have tests already, don't worry about it.
All right, thank you very much.